This is a story graphic design historians have told for decades. It's a tale that culminates as a partnership between global corporate capitalists, government organizations, and the field of graphic design. Many of the names will be familiar. They've been tightly woven into this narrative. It's important, at least for a time, that you are aware of this history, so that when one of these designers is mentioned in conversation, which they will be, or their work referenced as a comparison, you will have an informed understanding of this knowledge. But know that this story is changing as surely as our discipline is broadening its scope and moving away from the myopic view of what it means to be a graphic designer. One thing that I must point out, unlike the other lectures, this is a predominantly white male cast, illustrating the whiteness, patriarchy, and underlying global power structures that shaped this history. The focus begins in 1907 when the Deutsche Werkbund was formed, the German Association of Craftsmen. Werk stands for factory collaborators. Bund stands for federation. One prominent architect and designer, Peter Behrens, played a leading role in the organization. It's important to know the philosophy of the Deutsche Werkbund. They advocated for a marriage of art and technology. In other words, art in the service of mass production that machines afforded. They recognized the value of machines, which means they saw the value of machines for progress, and they called for a unity of standards and aesthetics. This is when standardization begins to play a greater role in the visual language of the arts. Until the Werkbund, retail sales dictated product design and promotion. Liberal capitalism, and specifically the merchants who had creative control over the design of the products, flooded the market with ostentatious products. Decoration and ornament layered every surface for no other purpose than to move more product off the shelves. The mass market catered mainly to buyers who displayed commodities decorated in aristocratic styles of the past. The everyday object seemed to exist only for the sake of its ornament. The surface of an object was nothing more than an advertisement for the commodity. Reacting against this, the Werkbund believed design was degraded and detached from the spirit of the age. One of their primary goals was to take away creative control of consumer goods from merchants and return it to designers and manufacturers. Their first attempt was a simple idea. It was to control window displays. They thought that if they could control the point of sale, they could, in turn, gain control of design within the market economy. Well, that attempt failed. Then something happened on a much grander scale. A progressive German electric company, AEG, renowned for its electrical engineering of consumer products, was the first industrial company to hire a Werkbund designer to help create and develop products, labeled specifically AEG. In 1907, Peter Behrens created this trademark that was then applied to industrial products, marketing materials, stationery, even the company's factories. Proprietary marks had been used for centuries by guilds and traders to label their goods. But the identity system Peter Behrens developed for AEG went far beyond trademarks and symbols. This mark was a unique visual sign distinct to one company and the products it manufactured. It came to carry more value and meaning than just a label. It would move customers to choose one product over another in the marketplace. And suddenly, the economic and aesthetic control transferred from the merchants and ornamentation to the manufacturers and functional design. With AEG and Peter Behrens, visual forms were being given exchange value in a new way. There was a new enterprising spirit, one that was ready to change the man-made environment, one that was modern. The Werkbund called this philosophy Gossam culture. Gossam culture means a new universal culture that could reform the man-made environment. Electrical consumer products were at the cutting edge of technology. To add context, in 1907, AEG had become the Apple computer of its day. This is the AEG booth at the Deutsche Werkbund Exposition in 1927. Peter Behrens designed the industrial products for the company, like these electric tea kettles, the street lamps, and fans. He was the first industrial designer. This standardized visual form and quality manufacturing profoundly influenced how consumers saw the company. From advertising and promotion to the architecture of its factory buildings and the products AEG manufactured, a progressive identity emerged. The image on the top shows Barron's innovative application of standardization in product design. The AEG tea kettles came with interchangeable parts that customers could specify. They offered 3 basic tea kettle forms, 2 lid designs, 2 different handles, 2 bases, 3 different metals, brass, copper, and nickel, and 3 finishes, smooth, hammered, and rippled. As a result of this modular approach to design, it was possible to manufacture 216 different varieties of electric tea kettles. Now, AEG limited their offer to 30 designs. Barron's graphic design program for AEG is considered the first comprehensive visual identity program. The Progressive Electric Company and the Werkbund architect joined together to create a new capitalist structure. The idea evolved as the brand identity that we know today. Standardization was even applied to promotional materials. 3 key elements are seen in Barron's graphic design program: a logo, a distinct typeface. AEG had its own typeface unique for the company and its identity. It was designed by Peter Behrens, called Behrens Antiqua. For its time, it was a new progressive typeface to represent AEG, and the typeface was unusual in Germany, an environment saturated with black letter. So in addition to logo, we see typography signifying progress. Along with logo and typeface, we see a consistent layout. Behrens developed a unified system for AEG which set the standards for corporate identity programs not seen for another 50 years. His graphic designs for AEG evolved over time. A poster advertising an electric lamp shows a mature graphic identity system. The geometric elements mathematically and rationally align to signify the physical property of radiant energy. Illumination is communicated with pure abstract geometry and use of materials. Those are simple geometric circles repeated and organized to communicate this complex concept. The machine-stamped gold foil material emphasizes elegance and illumination. In 1909, Peter Behrens designed this massive turbine hull for AEG with giant exposed exterior steel girders. Massive glass walls run from foundation to roofline. Form, material, and space was determined by the spirit of a new age, and design decisions were driven by new materials and function. In 1911, Peter Behrens began to focus primarily on architecture until his death in 1940. His apprentices include architects Walter Gropius, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, Adolf Meyer, and Le Corbusier, to name a few. Peter Behrens' apprentice, Walter Gropius, becomes the first director of the Bauhaus. Gropius was also part of the Deutsche Werkbund and believed in elevating the functional and aesthetic qualities of mass-produced consumer products. His design philosophy was that of the American architect Louis Sullivan, form follows function, which essentially means the aesthetic grows out of the function and the use of the object. In 1925, Gropius moved the Bauhaus to Dessau and out from under the control of the Weimar Republic. Out from government control and support, the restructured Bauhaus now began to sell their prototypes to industry. The building itself, designed in the factory aesthetic, had glass walls as the entire face of the building was supported by the steel and concrete building material. Gestile and constructivist underpinnings are obvious, as well as the similarities with the AEG turbine plant designed by Peter Behrens. Gropius, along with the Hungarian constructivist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, produced a series of books which played a pivotal role in spreading ideas throughout the world about Bauhaus principles. This series of 14 books disseminated Bauhaus theories and ideas about architecture and consumer design. On the right is one of the books acknowledging the founder of the Gestile movement, Theo van Doesburg's contribution to the principles of the Bauhaus. Fast forward in the storyline, the Swiss designer Max Bill is a critical link between the Bauhaus and the international typographic style that developed in Switzerland decades later. Bill studied at the Bauhaus under Walter Gropius and Moholy-Nagy. Continuing the rational thinking, Bill believed in the possibility of developing art purely on the basis of mathematical thinking. With this philosophy, he went on to co-found another German design school of his own in Ulm, Germany. This brings us to the international typographic style. The characteristics of Swiss design are key to late modernism and the notion of a universal global language. The characteristics are an asymmetrical order based on a mathematical grid system, standardization stemming from the Werkbund, structured layouts similar to AEG's, unjustified sans serif type, a departure from the ornate and decorative historical fonts, objective photography that replaces the individual hand of the artist with the machine-captured images of the camera, and text presenting information in a clear, factual manner, form following the function of communication. Reviewing the significant new sans serif families which emerged from the international typographic style, we have the visually cohesive type system Universe, the ubiquitous and efficient design of Helvetica, and Optima, a more humanist sans serif. A formal organization of the design through the use of a rational mathematical grid structure is the essence of the international typographic style, exemplified in the work of Joseph Müller-Brockmann, which is all explained to a global audience of designers in a trilingual journal, Neue Grafik, published quarterly in Zurich, Switzerland from 1958 to 1965. We began to see the principles of the international typographic style applied to multinational corporations. During the 1950s and 60s, prosperity and technology were linked to the large corporations that sprang up in a booming economy. World War II saw huge technological advances. For example, the computer is a product of the military. After the war, these technologies were directed to a consumer market, and large national and international companies began to recognize a need for a unified voice, a controlled visual expression of the corporate personality targeting a global audience. One company, one voice, integrated across all areas of communication. Let's look at some examples. In the 1960s, German graphic designer Otto Eicher combined a rational design approach of the international typographic style with its mathematical grid structures to the corporate communications of Lufthansa Airlines. He achieved this unification in the design of a corporate identity manual, a page of which you see here. With these guidelines, any designer working for the airline could maintain the same corporate look on anything from letterhead to packaging to the sides of airplanes. Eicher organized the symbol and typographic elements, placing detailed mathematical instructions on how the image was used. A structured grid is drawn around the size relationship of the symbol to the size and weight of the type. This shows the symbol's relationship to type and placement on the body of a plane. Everything about Eicher's system, from the salt and pepper packets handed out during flights to the uniforms worn by the crew, were covered in this highly specified identity manual. Corporate identity manuals became standard with large corporations. In America, modernism was stripped of its early socialist leanings. It became more of a symbol of capitalist goods. Consumerism flourished in the post-war economic boom, and Paul Rand became a leading corporate identity designer in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. These are just some of the many logos designed by Paul Rand. Saul Bass designed identities for AT&T, the United Way, United Airlines, and the Girl Scouts of America, to name a few. At the end of the 1960s, global corporations used a systematic approach to all of their communication strategies. The objective was to have a consistent, clear, objective voice with a diverse, widespread global audience. In 1974, the United States government recognized the importance of graphic design as a communication tool and initiated the Federal Design Improvement Program. The U.S. government hired designers to create unified programs for its many departments and agencies. One project was unifying the material for the National Park Service. Massimo Vignelli was hired to create a standardized program. Vignelli was a New York-based graphic, exhibition, and product designer trained as an architect in Milan, Italy. Like Adolf Eicher, he also adopted the rational principles of the International Typographic Style. Vignelli developed the unigrid system. This shows the unigrid system's use of horizontal bars for hierarchy. For example, in the image on the right, the park name Navy Yard is the heading, and each level below is delineated by the black band. Type is restricted to only Helvetica and Times Roman, a reductive approach to the overall system. The right image demonstrates to the design team how to integrate text with image. The unigrid format was flexible enough for simple photographic messages like this poster design for the Statue of Liberty, or informational brochures laid out in this example for the Florida Everglades. The aim of the unigrid was to unify the informational system used by a team of designers across 350 national park locations. Corporate expansion and technological advances led to more and more international travel. This created the need for a signage system that could cross language and cultural barriers. In 1974, as part of the U.S. Department of Transportation, Roger Cook and Don Shinosky were commissioned by an AIGA committee to design pictographic symbols for a transportation signage system to be applied across the United States. It was a pictographic signage system for a worldwide global traveler. Textual information was replaced with reductive geometric icons that could be read no matter what language the traveler understood. With airline travel making it possible to traverse the globe, universal clarity was never as important. The International Olympics brought an array of diversity from around the world together in one location. The concept of a comprehensive design system was not just desirable, it was necessary. In addition to wayfinding, guiding people from one place to another, the goal for Olympic design teams is to communicate the spirit of the Games for that year's particular host city, and to do so for an international audience. Let's take a look at one notable example. The 1968 Olympics took place in Mexico City, Mexico. It was the first time a Latin American country hosted the Olympic Games. And for Mexico City, the event was an opportunity to present to the world that they were a modern metropolis, as worthy as London, Berlin, or Tokyo to host this huge international event. So the Department of Publication and Urban Design Organizing Committee had an international competition to find a designer. The overarching strategy was to sell Mexico City to the world. Lance Wyman, Eduardo Terrazas, and Beatrice Trueblood were awarded the project. Wyman became the director of graphic design for the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. The team's challenge was to develop an identity and wayfinding system that would work in the sprawling urban environment of Mexico City with sports venues spread throughout. Additionally, to present a modern country with a great historical heritage to the world. Cultural heritage was emphasized as part of the nationalist strategy. The challenge required that the first part of the process was to conduct an exhaustive study of the Aztec and Mayan civilizations. This research would validate the formal elements that took shape. This is the original compass sketch of the identity. Lance Wyman integrated the geometry of the interlocking Olympic rings into the numbers for the year of the Games, 68. The rings inside the numbers created a repeated line. And research validated form, specifically the repetitive linear pattern. The designers were inspired by ancient artifacts and huichola tablets, the yarn art of the indigenous peoples of central Mexico. The tablets are created by pressing yarn in parallel lines onto a wax-covered wooden board. The design team was also influenced by the op art that was all over the New York City art scene at the time. Lance Wyman, Eduardo Terrazas, and Beatrice Trueblood used a repetition of line to form patterns radiating off the design Wyman had sketched. In addition to the ancient line patterns, they were also inspired by the bright, pure hues from the Mexican folk art, as well as the colors on the adobe homes and clothing and in the marketplaces. Through their extensive research, the team discovered the patterns and colors of Mexico and incorporated them into the identity. The radiating lines were applied everywhere, in clothing, on large balloons floating over the stadium, on uniforms, on the stadium itself. This was visibly striking from an airplane view as travelers arrived to the host city. And Wyman created a display typeface that was used on everything from brochures and tickets to signage and giant banners in the stadiums. Even postage stamps were part of the visual identity system. But that was just the beginning of the challenge to create a completely unified design system easily understood by people of all language backgrounds and flexible enough to be applied to a vast array of applications. Wyman also devised a system of pictograms for the athletic events and cultural events happening within the Olympic Village. He said of the icons, they were not stick figures, they were focused more on a part of the body or a piece of equipment, or combination of the two. And in this iconography, all events were then color-coded and applied to the signage like site identification, directional signs, maps, and other printed materials. Everything followed the same color codes. For example, crewing was always blue, cycling purple, track was green. The exterior signage was a system of modular components with interchangeable parts and banners hung throughout Mexico City. These used both the pictograms and color coding. Curbs were painted around the city. For example, if you wanted to attend a track and field event, you would identify the green graphic foot and follow the green line along the curb to the track and field arena. Everything was easily navigable. This would become one of the most famous campaigns in the history of the Olympics and graphic design, setting the standard for all Olympic identities that followed. The 1968 Mexico City Summer Olympics has been hailed as a pinnacle of branding and wayfinding. And that's where the story of this identity ends in graphic design history textbooks. But that's the shiny version of the graphic life of this work. It was hailed as the Games of Peace. And because of that, Wyman designed a dove symbol that you see here in the image on the right, lining the streets of Mexico. The dove symbol was also distributed as decals all over the city to shop owners to place in their storefront windows. But the Games of Peace were anything but in a turbulent Mexico. The country was in the midst of social unrest. During 1968, students flooded the streets in protest, demanding a more transparent and less repressive and violent government. In addition, students seen here on September 13th called for the release of political prisoners. The story design textbooks have failed to include is the story of the designs in the wake of this civil unrest, the unrest that government officials were covering up to the rest of the world. The graphic system Lance Wyman and his team established for the promotion of Mexico City and the Olympic Games was co-opted by the student protesters. They turned the graphics against the government who had paid for them. They used the signage and lettering of the Games of Peace to create an anti-government protest campaign. Here you see an altered graphic in this student protest poster representing the police brutality happening in and around the city. Students sprayed red paint on the symbol of peace on those merchant window displays all around the city. They illustrated a knife stabbing through Wyman's icon of the dove. The handmade character of the line work and the registration that is slightly off is a stark contrast to Wyman's slick and refined graphics. Appropriating the government-sponsored messaging boldly exposed its own hypocrisy. No matter how global or how universal and objective a campaign appears to be, it's not. Design is always political. In the case of the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, it was a veiled attempt to rebrand a violent, oppressive government into a progressive modern country. The history we tell or choose to ignore is political as well. This protest on August 27, 1968, was typical in size and character to the infamous gathering the night of October 2nd. That day, 10 days before the start of the Olympic Games, the government ordered the protesting students in Tlatelolco Square to dispense. At the same time, some 500 soldiers and 200 small tanks surrounded the estimated 10 to 20,000 peaceful protesters. Soon after, helicopters flooded the square with light, and the soldiers and police opened fire. Hundreds were killed and over 1,000 were arrested. The blood was washed away, and the government covered up any traces of the massacre. The international community failed to recognize the government act of extreme violence on its own students and citizens, choosing instead to only see the branded spectacle of peace. At the time, the event was portrayed in the national media as a military suppression of a violent student uprising. But later analysis indicates that the gathering was peaceful prior to any army's advance. The 1960s saw protests throughout the Western world. In America, there were many. We saw the Civil Rights Movement, opposition to the Vietnam War, women's liberation, and a youth counterculture where rock and roll created a generation gap between young adults and the establishment. And no, these protest movements were all in a very tight time frame. The language of the international typographic style had gained a reputation the world over through a global corporate presence. Swiss typography became synonymous with the corporate design and multinational organizations. Corporations benefited from the unity of its rational, systematized approach. But a younger community, along with everyone else, began to rebel against the impact of corporate and government power structures which became dominant forces of control in the world, including their aesthetics. And a shift happened away from the globalism and universalism toward an approach focused on self-expression and personal experience. This reaction soon garnered a name: postmodernism. Like music and culture in general, the postmodern aesthetic divided a generation of young designers with their predecessors still dedicated to the ideals of late modernism.